Maya stepped between the bullies and the Vampire King's wheelchair-bound son at the coffee shop. The jeering stopped when the boy's eyes met hers, until he rose from his chair like darkness unfolding, and she realized the heir to the Night Throne had been hiding his true strength all along. The fluorescent lights of Nocturne Cafe buzzed with their usual electric hum as Maya Chen wiped down the espresso machine for the third time that hour. Her pre-med textbooks splayed open beside the register like wounded birds. At 24, she had perfected the art of studying between customers, her highlighter moving in quick, precise strokes across pages of anatomical diagrams, while her ears stayed tuned to the door chime that announced another insomniac seeking caffeine sanctuary. The arts district attracted its share of night creatures. From painters chasing inspiration to musicians fleeing day jobs. But Maya had learned not to ask too many questions about the regulars who paid with century-old coins or spoke in languages that made her teeth ache. Her father's medical bills had taught her that survival sometimes meant accepting mysteries as long as they came with tips. The cafe's owner, Mrs. Petrov, had hired Maya specifically for her ability to remain calm in strange situations, a skill honed during years of defending smaller kids from playground bullies and later, defending her immigrant family from bureaucratic cruelty. Tonight felt different, though, charged with the kind of electric tension that preceded thunderstorms, and Maya found herself glancing repeatedly at the clock, as if time itself might provide answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. The door chimed at 11:47, admitting a group of college students whose laughter carried the sharp edge of privilege and boredom, their designer clothes and careless confidence marking them as the type who viewed service workers as background props in their personal dramas. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Maya recognized them from previous visits, the kind of customers who left messes and small tips while treating the cafe like their personal living room. But tonight they seemed more aggressive, their voices carrying further than usual as they claimed the large corner table. She continued her studying, one ear monitoring their increasingly loud conversation about some party they had attended, when the door chimed again and Damien entered like a whisper made flesh. He came every Tuesday at the same time, always alone, always silent, navigating his ornate wheelchair with the fluid grace of someone who had long ago made peace with its necessity. His pale skin seemed to drink in the cafe's warm light, and his dark hair fell across features so perfectly symmetrical they might have been carved from marble, but it was his eyes that always caught Maya off guard, silver pools that held depths she couldn't fathom. He never spoke, never made eye contact with anyone except her during the brief moment when he placed his order by pointing at the menu, but somehow his presence transformed the space around him, making colors seem richer and shadows more substantial. His wheelchair was a work of art in itself, carved from some dark wood Maya couldn't identify and inlaid with metalwork that seemed to shift in the light, and he always paid with old gold coins that the register accepted despite their obvious age and foreign markings. Maya had grown protective of this gentle regular, noting how other customers sometimes stared or whispered, and she always made sure his usual table in the quiet corner was available when he arrived. Tonight, however, the college students had claimed that section, and their voices grew louder as Damien wheeled past them toward his preferred spot. The cruel laughter started as whispers but escalated quickly, fueled by whatever alcohol they had consumed before arriving, and the pack mentality that turned individual cowardice into collective cruelty. Maya's hand tightened on her highlighter as she heard fragments of their conversation, words like freak and cripple floating through the air like poison, and she watched Damien's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly as he tried to ignore them. The leader of the group, a blond boy whose father probably owned half the city, stood up with exaggerated drunken bravado and began mimicking Damien's silent demeanor, contorting his face into what he clearly thought was a comedic impression while his friends erupted in appreciative laughter. Maya felt the familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same protective rage that had gotten her suspended twice in high school for confronting bullies. But this time she didn't hesitate or consider consequences. She abandoned her textbooks and stepped around the counter, her sneakers silent on the cafe's worn tile floor as she approached the group with the steady confidence of someone who had faced down worse odds and survived. The college students were so absorbed in their cruelty that they didn't notice her approach until she planted herself directly between them and Damien, her small frame somehow creating a barrier that felt immovable despite her size. "That's enough," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had learned from years of defending the defenseless, steady despite the racing of her heart and the way her hands trembled with suppressed anger. "Leave him alone." The words cut through their laughter like a blade through silk, creating a moment of shocked silence that stretched between heartbeats, and Maya felt rather than saw Damien's reaction behind her, some shift in the air that made her skin prickle with electricity. The blonde boy's face flushed red with embarrassment and alcohol, his privilege wounded by being challenged by someone he clearly considered beneath his notice. But before he could respond, Maya felt the temperature in the cafe drop several degrees. The laughter died completely when Damien's wheelchair made the softest sound, a whisper of movement that shouldn't have been audible over the ambient noise, but somehow commanded everyone's attention. Maya turned to see Damien's eyes meet hers, silver orbs that held gratitude so profound it made her chest tight. But there was something else there too, something ancient and powerful that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. Then the shadows began to move in ways that defied physics, pooling around Damien's chair like living things drawn to their master. And Maya watched in stunned silence as he rose from his wheelchair, with the fluid grace of darkness taking human form. The ornate chair remained empty behind him as he stood to his full height, easily 6 feet tall, his presence filling the space in ways that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with power that had been carefully hidden but never truly absent. The college students fled without another word, their bravado evaporating in the face of something their privileged minds couldn't categorize or dismiss, leaving only the soft chime of the door and the lingering scent of winter air. Maya stood frozen in the sudden silence, her worldview reshaping itself around this impossible moment, when Damien spoke for the first time in all their months of careful distance. "Thank you for seeing me as more than my limitations," he said, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't place and depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades. The wheelchair remained empty behind him like a discarded shell, and Maya realized that everything she thought she knew about her quiet regular had been carefully constructed theater, a performance designed to hide truths that her rational mind struggled to accept. The fluorescent lights seemed different now, harsher somehow, as if reality itself had shifted to accommodate this new understanding, and Maya found herself searching Damien's face for answers to questions she didn't yet know how to ask. His silver eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel seen in ways that went beyond the physical, and she understood that her simple act of defense had changed something fundamental between them, opened a door that could never be closed again. The cafe around them felt smaller suddenly, as if the familiar space could no longer contain what had been revealed. And Maya sensed that her life had just taken a turn toward territories she had never imagined existed in the same city where she studied anatomy and served coffee to insomniacs. Damien's presence seemed to fill every corner of the room, despite his perfectly human appearance. And Maya realized that her protective instincts had just introduced her to a world where the stakes were higher and more dangerous than any playground confrontation she had ever faced. The next evening found Maya pacing her small studio apartment, replaying the previous night's events until they felt like scenes from a movie rather than her actual memories. She had left work early, claiming illness when Mrs. Petrov noticed her distraction, but the truth was that she couldn't concentrate on anything after Damien's transformation. Sleep had been impossible, her dreams filled with silver eyes and moving shadows, and her medical textbooks felt suddenly inadequate when faced with phenomena that science couldn't explain. She had almost convinced herself it was exhaustion-induced hallucination when the soft knock came at her door. Maya opened it to find Damien standing in her hallway, looking perfectly ordinary, except for the way shadows seemed to cling to him like living things, and the fact that her building's security system had apparently allowed him access without buzzing her apartment. He wore dark jeans and a simple sweater that did nothing to diminish his otherworldly presence, and his silver eyes held an apology that made her chest tight. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice carrying that same ageless quality that had shaken her the night before, and Maya stepped aside without conscious thought, her body moving before her mind could catalog all the reasons why inviting mysterious strangers into her home violated every safety rule she had ever learned. He moved through her small space with careful grace, as if cataloging every detail while respecting the boundaries of her personal sanctuary, and Maya found herself seeing her apartment through his eyes, noting the medical textbooks stacked on every surface and the anatomical posters that covered her walls like educational wallpaper. "I owe you an explanation," Damien said, settling onto her couch with the kind of fluid movement that suggested his wheelchair had been performance rather than necessity. And Maya perched on the edge of her desk chair, maintaining distance while her curiosity warred with caution. "My name is Prince Damien Ashworth, heir to the Vampire King," he began, the words falling into her small apartment like stones into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reach every corner of her carefully ordered life. The wheelchair, the silence. They were parts of a curse that bound me for 3 centuries, punishment for my father's attempts to bridge our world with yours. Maya's medical training kicked in automatically, her mind attempting to process this information through familiar frameworks of diagnosis and treatment, but vampires fell outside every category she had studied. The curse could only be broken by genuine human compassion directed toward me without knowledge of what I truly was, Damien continued, his eyes never leaving her face as if searching for signs of fear or disbelief. "Your defense last night was the first truly selfless act anyone has shown me in 300 years. The first time someone saw me as worthy of protection rather than pity." Maya felt the weight of his words settle over her like a blanket, heavy with implications she was only beginning to understand. "The gold coins," she said, her voice sounding strange in her own ears, and Damien smiled with genuine amusement. "Ancient currency from my father's treasury," he confirmed, "though your register accepts them because our kind has had centuries to integrate our systems with yours. We exist in parallel to human society, hidden but not separate, following our own laws while respecting yours." Maya's apartment felt smaller with each revelation, as if the walls were closing in to accommodate truths too large for such an ordinary space. She thought of all the strange regulars at the cafe, the customers who paid with old coins or spoke in languages that hurt her ears, and wondered how many other supernatural beings she had served without recognition. "The vampire court has been watching you since last night," Damien continued, his tone growing more serious. "Because my recovery has sent shockwaves through our society. Some see it as hope for our isolated people, proof that cooperation with humans is possible, while others view it as a dangerous violation of the old ways that will lead to our destruction." Maya realized that her simple act of kindness had thrust her into the center of political forces she couldn't begin to understand, her life becoming collateral damage in a supernatural conflict that predated her existence by centuries. "My father wishes to meet you, to formally acknowledge your role in breaking the curse. But I wanted to ask your permission first, because once you enter our world, there is no returning to ignorance." The choice he offered felt both generous and terrible, a chance to satisfy her curiosity balanced against the safety of remaining blind to truths that could destroy the life she had carefully built. Maya thought of her medical studies, her plans for the future, her father's health problems that required her steady income and insurance coverage, all the human concerns that seemed suddenly fragile when weighed against supernatural politics. But she also thought of Damien's gratitude, the way his eyes had held depths she wanted to explore, and the feeling that defending him had been the most important thing she had ever done. "Will I still be able to continue my studies?" she asked, and Damien's expression grew thoughtful. "Our world operates alongside yours, not instead of it," he said, "though knowledge of our existence will change how you see everything around you." Maya understood that he was offering her a choice between safe ignorance and dangerous truth, between the known challenges of her current life and unknown perils that came with supernatural awareness. She looked around her apartment again, at the medical textbooks that represented years of struggle and sacrifice, at the posters showing human anatomy that suddenly seemed incomplete when supernatural possibilities existed, and made the decision that would define the rest of her life. "I want to meet your father," she said, and watched something like relief flood Damien's features. "Tomorrow night," he said, rising from her couch with that inhuman grace. "There is a formal entrance to our court through the old cathedral in the historic district," and Maya nodded, even though she felt like she was agreeing to step off a cliff into darkness. After he left, she sat in her apartment surrounded by the same furniture and books that had defined her world just hours earlier. But everything felt different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. She spent the rest of the night researching vampires in folklore and literature, trying to prepare herself for tomorrow's meeting. But she understood that nothing she read would truly prepare her for the reality of entering a world that existed in the shadows of her own. The old cathedral's Gothic spires pierced the city's skyline like stone prayers, their weathered facades hiding secrets that Maya was only beginning to understand as she approached the massive wooden doors. Damien waited for her at the entrance, no longer the silent figure in a wheelchair, but clearly a prince in his own domain. His bearing regal despite his modern clothes and the way other pedestrians unconsciously gave him space on the sidewalk. The setting sun painted the cathedral's stones in shades of amber and wine, and Maya noticed how shadows seemed to gather around Damien even in the failing light, as if darkness recognized its master. "This way," he said, guiding her not through the main entrance but around to a side door she would never have noticed on her own, its iron handle worn smooth by centuries of use. The door opened at his touch without key or password, revealing stairs that descended far deeper than any normal building's foundation should allow, carved from stone that felt older than the city above. Maya's medical training had prepared her for many things, but walking into what felt like a supernatural rabbit hole tested the limits of her rational worldview. The air grew cooler as they descended, carrying scents she couldn't identify, but that made her skin prickle with electricity, and she realized that they were entering a space that existed parallel to, but separate from the human world she knew. The stairs ended in a vast hall that defied architectural possibility, its soaring ceilings lost in shadow despite the warm light cast by chandeliers that moved with their own will. The space was filled with figures that drifted between human and something else, their movements too fluid, and their beauty too perfect to be entirely mortal, and Maya understood that she was seeing vampires in their natural state for the first time. The court was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture given supernatural life, with columns that twisted skyward like frozen music and windows that showed stars instead of the city above, creating an atmosphere that was both magnificent and slightly terrifying. Courtiers paused in their conversations to watch Maya's entrance, their ancient eyes cataloging her humanity with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. And she felt like a field mouse who had wandered into a gathering of elegant predators. Damien's presence beside her provided some protection, his status as heir apparent creating a buffer of respectful distance. But Maya could feel the weight of supernatural attention like pressure against her skin. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a dais that seemed to be carved from a single piece of black marble, sat the Vampire King. King Alexander Ashworth commanded the space around him without effort, his presence so powerful that Maya felt it before she saw him clearly. He was perhaps the most beautiful and terrible creature she had ever encountered, his features perfect in ways that made classical sculptures seem crude by comparison, but it was his eyes that truly captured her attention. They held the weight of centuries, the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of someone who had lived through the rise and fall of empires, and when they focused on her, Maya felt seen in ways that went beyond the physical. She approached the dais with Damien beside her, acutely aware of her ordinary humanity in this gathering of immortal beings, but also aware of the strange honor being shown to her through this formal introduction. The king rose as they approached, a gesture that caused whispers to ripple through the assembled court, and Maya understood that she was witnessing something unprecedented in vampire protocol. "Miss Chen," King Alexander said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power tempered by genuine warmth, "you have given my son something I thought lost forever, and for that, you have my eternal gratitude." Maya found herself responding with a formal curtsy she had never learned, but somehow knew was appropriate, her body moving according to instincts she didn't recognize. "Your Majesty," she managed, unsure of proper address but hoping sincerity would compensate for any protocol mistakes. The king's smile transformed his terrible beauty into something almost approachable, though Maya remained aware that she stood in the presence of a being who could probably tear her apart without effort. Around the great hall, she began to distinguish between different factions of vampires, noting the subtle ways they grouped themselves and the tension that underlied their perfect manners. Near the king's right hand stood a woman whose beauty was sharp enough to cut, her expression suggesting that Maya's presence was both unwelcome and potentially dangerous. "Lady Vasa," Damien murmured near her ear, leader of the traditionalist faction, and Maya understood that she had just identified her first enemy in this supernatural court. On the king's left, a distinguished gentleman with kind eyes watched the proceedings with obvious approval, and Damien's whispered introduction identified him as Minister Blackthorn, head of the progressive faction that supported increased cooperation with humanity. Maya realized that her simple act of kindness had thrust her into the center of a political conflict that had been brewing for centuries, her presence becoming a symbol in a philosophical war about vampire society's future. The king gestured for silence, and the assembled court turned their attention to the dais with the kind of absolute focus that spoke of millennia-old hierarchies. "Miss Chen," he continued, "by showing compassion to my heir without knowledge of his true nature, you have fulfilled the conditions of an ancient binding, one that has held our family in its grip for 300 years. Your courage and kindness have not only freed Damien from his curse, but proven that cooperation between our peoples is possible." Maya felt the weight of supernatural history settling on her shoulders as she understood that she had become part of something much larger than a simple act of defending someone from bullies. Lady Vasa stepped forward, her movement causing the assembled vampires to tense almost imperceptibly, and Maya sensed challenge in the air before the woman even spoke. "Your Majesty," Lady Vasa said, her voice carrying the music of someone who had perfected the art of polite menace. "While we celebrate the prince's recovery, ancient law demands that any human granted such honor must prove their worthiness through the traditional trials." Maya watched the king's expression grow carefully neutral as political forces she didn't understand came into play, and she realized that her invitation to the vampire court had been as much about testing her as honoring her. "The trials of courage, wisdom, and sacrifice have protected our court for millennia," Lady Vasa continued, "ensuring that only those truly worthy of our trust are granted access to our secrets." Maya felt Damien tense beside her and saw Minister Blackthorn's concerned expression, understanding that she had just been maneuvered into a position that could prove as dangerous as it was honorable. The king's ancient eyes met hers across the space between them, and Maya saw regret in their depths, the sorrow of someone forced to allow potentially harmful traditions to proceed by the weight of laws older than nations. "Very well," King Alexander said, his voice carrying resignation and something that might have been apology. The trials will commence at tomorrow's midnight, as tradition demands. And Maya realized that her supernatural education was about to become far more intensive and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The Hall of Shadows existed in a space between spaces, its obsidian walls reflecting not light, but memory itself. And Maya stood at its center, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon her shoulders like invisible chains. The hundreds of vampires who had gathered to witness the binding ceremony arranged themselves in perfect concentric circles around her, their ancient faces showing expressions that ranged from curious anticipation to barely concealed hostility, and Maya understood that she was about to undergo something that would either elevate her beyond human limitations or destroy her completely. King Alexander stood at the hall's apex, his presence commanding absolute silence as he began to speak in words that seemed to reshape reality itself. The binding ceremony you are about to undergo, Miss Chen, is not merely recognition of your service to our house, but the creation of a mystical bond that will link your life force to my son's for all time, he explained, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. If you should die, Damien will return to his cursed state, weakened and vulnerable to our enemies. But if he should perish, you will lose the supernatural protection this bond provides, leaving you defenseless against the many who view your presence here as an abomination. Maya felt the enormity of what was being asked settle over her like a burial shroud, understanding that she was being invited to tie her fate to Damien's in ways that transcended normal human relationships. But she also saw the political necessity of the arrangement, how it would make her invaluable to the progressive faction while simultaneously painting a target on her back for traditionalists. Lady Vessa stepped forward from her position among the elder vampires, her beauty sharp enough to cut glass, and her smile holding promises of pain. The trials you must face were designed by the three eldest members of our court, each representing a different faction and philosophy, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had helped craft these tests across centuries of use. You must demonstrate courage by facing your deepest fears without flinching, wisdom by solving riddles that have confounded scholars for millennia, and sacrifice by choosing the needs of others above your own desires, even when that choice costs you everything you hold dear. Maya realized that these trials had been carefully constructed to favor vampire sensibilities over human ones, designed to test qualities that supernatural beings valued while potentially exploiting the weaknesses that mortality imposed. But she also understood that refusing to participate would be seen as cowardice and would destroy any hope of building bridges between their worlds. The first trial began without warning, as shadows poured from the walls like living smoke, coalescing into forms that made Maya's heart stop with recognition and terror. The shadow wraiths wore the faces of everyone she loved, her father dying slowly in a hospital bed while she was trapped in supernatural politics, her mother calling her name from a burning building she could never reach, her younger brother being torn apart by creatures that moved like nightmares given flesh. Maya's medical training kicked in automatically as she recognized the trial as a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, designed to trigger fight-or-flight responses that would reveal her true character under extreme stress. But understanding the mechanism did nothing to diminish the emotional impact of watching her family suffer and die in endless permutations. The shadow wraiths circled her like predators, their familiar faces twisted with accusation and pain, and Maya felt the overwhelming urge to fight them, to strike out against these manifestations of her deepest fears, but something in their eyes stopped her cold. Behind the supernatural horror, she could see the love that defined her relationships with these people, the bonds that had shaped her into someone who would defend a stranger against bullies without thought for her own safety. And she understood that violence against even these twisted reflections would be a betrayal of everything they had taught her about courage and compassion. Instead of fighting, Maya stepped forward and embraced the shadow wraith wearing her father's face, feeling the darkness try to pour into her soul, even as she whispered words of love and forgiveness into its ear. "I choose to love you even if I lose you," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Because the alternative is to live in fear, and fear is just another kind of death." The shadow wraiths dissolved at her touch, their forms becoming wisps of memory that swirled around her like protective spirits. And Maya understood that the courage trial had never been about conquering fear, but about choosing love despite its presence. The assembled vampires murmured among themselves, their expressions showing surprise at her unconventional approach, and Maya caught Damien's proud smile from across the hall, understanding that she had passed the first test by redefining its parameters entirely. The wisdom trial materialized as an ancient puzzle box that appeared in her hands without transition, its surface covered in runes that seemed to shift and change, even as she studied them. Accompanied by a riddle that echoed through the hall in voices older than civilization itself. "What is the nature of true strength?" the voices asked, and Maya felt the weight of millennia pressing down upon her as she realized that generations of beings had struggled with this question. The puzzle box responded to her touch by revealing layers upon layers of complexity, each solution unlocking new challenges that seemed to multiply exponentially, and Maya understood that brute force or clever manipulation would never solve something designed to test deeper understanding. She thought about her decision to defend Damien, how it had come not from confidence in her ability to win, but from the simple inability to stand by while someone suffered, and suddenly the answer became clear with crystalline certainty. "True strength isn't about power over others," she said, her voice ringing through the hall with conviction, "but about the courage to remain vulnerable and open despite being hurt, to offer love and protection even when you might be rejected or destroyed for it." The puzzle box dissolved in her hands like morning mist, its runes forming patterns of light that danced around her body before fading into the shadows, and Maya saw approval in King Alexander's ancient eyes, understanding that her answer had resonated with truths the vampires had perhaps forgotten in their pursuit of safety through isolation. Lady Vaesa's expression grew colder as the sacrifice trial began, her voice cutting through the hall's expectant silence like a blade through silk. "For your final test," she announced, "you must choose between two paths, each carrying a price that will define the rest of your existence." Maya felt the temperature drop several degrees as Vaesa continued her explanation, understanding that this trial had been designed specifically to destroy her by forcing an impossible decision. "You may save Prince Damien's life by accepting permanent exile from the human world, abandoning your medical studies, your family, and everything you once called home to serve as his bound protector for all eternity," Lady Vessa said, her smile promising pain. "Or you may return to your mortal life and let him face the assassination attempts that will surely come when our enemies realize how his restoration has changed the balance of power in our society." Maya felt the weight of the choice crushing down upon her like a physical force, understanding that either option would cost her something essential to her identity. But she also sensed something wrong about the trial itself, some element that didn't match the careful balance she had observed in the previous tests. Her medical training made her sensitive to patterns and abnormalities, and something about Lady Vessa's behavior triggered alarm bells that had nothing to do with the supernatural politics swirling around her. The vampire's perfect composure seemed forced, her beautiful features holding tension that spoke of secrets being carefully guarded, and Maya noticed how she avoided looking directly at King Alexander despite addressing him formally. As Maya studied the assembled vampires more carefully, she began to notice other subtle signs that something was wrong. How some of the older court members seemed more fragile than their ageless appearances should allow. How shadows fell differently around certain figures, as if their very essence was diminished. Her pre-med training had taught her to recognize the signs of systemic poisoning, and she realized with growing horror that someone had been slowly weakening the vampire court from within, targeting the progressive faction with toxins designed to appear like natural aging. The pieces fell together with terrible clarity as Maya remembered fragments of conversation she had overheard, references to the king's increasing need for rest, and Lady Vaesa's helpful suggestions about traditional remedies that would ease his discomfort. The poison would be undetectable except during specific lunar phases, when vampire physiology became temporarily vulnerable. And Maya realized with shock that tonight's new moon provided the only opportunity to expose what had been happening and save not just King Alexander, but the entire progressive movement. Speaking out would require her to reveal knowledge that could only come from human medical training, marking her permanently as an outsider who brought dangerous foreign concepts into vampire society. But remaining silent would allow Lady Vessa's plot to succeed and doom any hope of cooperation between their peoples. Maya understood that this was the true sacrifice trial, not the false choice Vessa had presented, but the decision to risk everything she had gained to protect people who barely accepted her presence among them. "Your Majesty," Maya said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall, "I believe someone has been poisoning you with a compound designed to mimic natural weakness, detectable only during the new moon when your supernatural defenses are at their lowest point." The accusation hit the assembled vampires like a physical blow, their perfect composure shattering as whispers of shock and outrage filled the air. And Maya watched Lady Vaesa's mask of noble concern slip to reveal the face of someone who had been discovered in an act of ultimate betrayal. Lady Vaesa's composure cracked completely as she realized her centuries-long plan had been exposed by the very human she had sought to destroy, and her beautiful features twisted with rage and desperation. "You know nothing of our ways, child," she spat, her voice losing its musical quality to reveal something harsh and broken underneath. "You speak of poison and betrayal, while knowing nothing of the pain that drives such choices. Nothing of what it means to watch everything you love destroyed by trust, misplaced in human hearts." Maya felt the weight of Lady Vessa's accusation, but also sensed the deeper pain driving the vampire's actions, understanding that hatred this profound could only come from love that had been twisted beyond recognition by trauma and loss. The hall erupted in chaos as other vampires began examining King Alexander more closely, their ancient senses finally detecting the subtle signs of poisoning that Maya's medical training had allowed her to recognize. And she watched Minister Blackthorn's face pale with horror as he realized how close they had come to losing their progressive leader to internal sabotage. Maya's medical knowledge became the key to saving King Alexander's life, but the process required her to remain in the vampire court for 3 days while he recovered from centuries of slow poisoning, 3 days that her carefully structured human life could not afford to lose. She had already missed crucial pre-med exams and multiple work shifts, her absence from the coffee shop leaving Mrs. Petrov scrambling to cover the night shift, while Maya's professors marked her absent from classes that could determine her entire academic future. The irony was not lost on her that saving the Vampire King might cost her the medical career that had given her the knowledge to recognize his condition in the first place. But she found herself unable to leave while his life hung in the balance, her healer's instincts overriding practical concerns about her own future. The king's private chambers existed in a wing of the court that few vampires ever entered, its walls lined with tapestries depicting the long history of his reign and its windows, showing not the city above, but views of places that existed only in memory or dreams. Maya established herself beside his bed, like a guardian angel, monitoring his vital signs with equipment she had somehow convinced Minister Blackthorn to acquire from the human world, her medical training adapting to treat a physiology that no textbook had ever described. During the long hours of vigil, other court members began seeking her out, drawn by curiosity about the human who had saved their king and stayed to ensure his recovery, despite having no obligation to do so beyond basic compassion. Maya discovered that centuries of isolation had left many vampires suffering from ailments that bridged the physical and supernatural realms, conditions that their traditional healing methods could address only partially because they had no framework for understanding how magical and biological systems could interact in complex ways. Her unique perspective as both healer and outsider allowed her to see patterns that vampire physicians had missed, to suggest treatments that combined modern medical knowledge with ancient supernatural wisdom in ways that neither approach could achieve alone. A vampire elder came to her with joint pain that had persisted for decades, and Maya realized that his condition stemmed not from age, but from a magical binding that had never properly healed, requiring both physical therapy and ritual cleansing to address fully. Another court member suffered from what appeared to be chronic fatigue, but Maya's examination revealed that her supernatural energy was being drained by an emotional trauma that had created actual physical pathways for power loss, requiring psychological healing combined with specific nutritional supplements to restore her strength. Word of these successes spread through the court like wildfire, and Maya found herself becoming an unofficial physician to beings whose medical needs had been neglected for generations, her small knowledge feeling inadequate in the face of such ancient suffering, but somehow sufficient to make meaningful differences in their lives. Damien spent long hours with her during the king's recovery, and their conversations revealed layers of his character that Maya had never suspected during their brief interactions at the coffee shop. The curse that had bound him to the wheelchair had been more than simple physical limitation, affecting his entire sense of self-worth and place in vampire society in ways that went far beyond mobility issues. He had begun to believe that he truly was broken, that his father's attempts to break the curse were motivated by pity rather than love, and that his eventual succession to the throne would burden their people with a weak and inadequate leader. Maya's defense had given him not just physical restoration, but emotional healing, proof that someone could see value in him even when he appeared most vulnerable, and their growing bond was based on mutual recognition of strength rather than one-sided gratitude or supernatural compulsion. She learned that Damien had spent his centuries of confinement studying human society, fascinated by their ability to adapt and innovate despite their mortality, and that his progressive political views stemmed not from rejection of vampire traditions, but from admiration for humanity's capacity to change and grow. He saw in Maya not a savior who had rescued him from disability, but an equal who had chosen courage when faced with intimidation, someone whose moral compass operated according to principles he had learned to admire but had never seen demonstrated so clearly. Their conversations revealed how much they had in common, despite their different species, both of them caught between worlds and struggling to find their place in systems that didn't quite accommodate their perspectives, both committed to healing and protection as fundamental values that transcended political boundaries. Maya told him about her father's illness and her family's financial struggles, how her medical training was motivated not by abstract desire to help people, but by specific experiences with suffering and the healthcare system's limitations, and Damien shared his own experiences with feeling like a burden on the people who loved him despite their efforts to prove otherwise. By the third day, King Alexander had recovered enough to sit up and take solid food, his supernatural physiology responding well to the combination of traditional vampire healing methods and modern medical support that Maya had orchestrated with Minister Blackthorn's help. The king's gratitude was profound but complicated, tinged with regret that her assistance had come at such personal cost and concern about what her prolonged absence from the human world might mean for her future plans. Maya tried to minimize the impact, claiming that a few missed exams and work shifts could be managed, but she knew that her professors would not accept supernatural emergencies as valid excuses, and that Mrs. Petrov might have already found a replacement for her unreliable night shift worker. The vampire court had become a second home during her 3-day vigil, its strange beauty and ancient rhythms feeling natural in ways that surprised her, but she also missed the familiar chaos of her human life and worried about the growing distance between herself and the world she had always expected to inhabit. As she prepared to leave the court, and returned to damage control in her ordinary existence, Lady Vessa appeared in the doorway of the king's chambers like an elegant specter of unfinished business. The vampire's perfect features showed none of their earlier rage, but Maya sensed dangerous currents running beneath her composed surface, threats that had been temporarily submerged but not eliminated by recent events. "I challenge you to a blood moon duel," Lady Vasa announced, her voice carrying the formal cadence of ancient ritual, with the winner determining whether humans can ever truly belong in vampire society. Maya felt the weight of supernatural law settling around her like chains, understanding that this challenge could not be refused without dishonoring not just herself, but the entire progressive movement that had come to see her as a symbol of possibility. The duel would take place during the next blood moon in 3 weeks, giving her time to prepare, but also time to worry about facing an opponent who possessed centuries of experience and supernatural abilities that Maya could barely comprehend. And she realized that her integration into vampire society was about to be tested in the most direct and dangerous way possible. The blood moon duel took place in a realm that existed between memory and nightmare, where the laws of physics bent to accommodate the weight of supernatural will and centuries of accumulated trauma manifested as living shadows that clawed at the edges of perception. Maya found herself standing in a space that felt like the inside of a kaleidoscope made from broken glass and old wounds, where Lady Vessa's perfectly composed exterior had been stripped away to reveal the raw anguish that drove her hatred of humanity. The arena itself shifted and changed according to the emotional intensity of its occupants, walls materializing from crystallized tears and floors forming from the sediment of lost dreams. And Maya understood that this battle would be fought not with weapons, but with truth itself as both sword and shield. Lady Vessa appeared across the ethereal battlefield like a wraith given form, her beauty now terrible in its perfection because Maya could see through it to the broken soul beneath, centuries of pain and betrayal having carved hollows in her spirit that no amount of vampire healing could touch. The duel began without warning as Vessa's memories poured over Maya like a flood of liquid darkness, dragging her consciousness back through time to witness the events that had shaped the vampire's implacable hatred. Maya found herself experiencing the 1800s through Vessa's eyes, seeing a world where vampires and humans lived in careful coexistence, hidden from broader society but not entirely separate, their communities intertwining in ways that seemed impossible given the current state of supernatural isolation. She watched Vyasa as she had been then, younger in appearance but ancient, even by vampire standards. Her heart opened by love for a human scholar named Thomas, who had dedicated his life to studying the intersection between magic and natural philosophy. Their bond had been profound, transcending species barriers through mutual respect and genuine affection, and Maya felt the echo of that connection like warmth against her skin, even as she sensed the approaching darkness that would destroy it. Thomas had been brilliant and kind. His research focused on ways that supernatural abilities could be used to heal rather than harm. His notes filled with theories about combining vampire regenerative powers with human medical knowledge to create unprecedented advances in treating disease and injury. Maya watched their courtship unfold through Vasa's memories, seeing how Thomas had courted the vampire lady with flowers that bloomed at midnight and poetry written in languages that existed only in dreams. How their love had seemed to prove that the barriers between their worlds were artificial constructs rather than natural laws. But then the memories turned dark as Thomas began showing signs of change that Vesa had attributed to the stress of his research, but that Maya's medical training immediately recognized as symptoms of mental domination. His pupils became permanently dilated, despite normal lighting conditions. His movements took on a mechanical quality that suggested external control, and his speech patterns shifted to match those of someone whose thoughts were no longer entirely their own. Maya tried to warn the memory Vesa about what she was seeing, But the duel's rules prevented interference with events that had already transpired, forcing her to watch helplessly as Thomas led vampire hunters to the hidden sanctuaries where Vessa's entire bloodline had made their homes. The massacre that followed was brutal beyond description. Hunters armed with supernatural weapons tearing through vampires who had trusted Thomas enough to lower their defenses. And Maya felt Vessa's anguish as a physical pain in her chest as she watched centuries of family history being erased in a single night of betrayal. But Maya's medical knowledge allowed her to see what Vessa had missed in her grief and rage, the subtle signs that Thomas was not acting of his own will, but under the influence of someone who had turned his mind into a weapon against the people he loved. The possession had been masterfully done, leaving enough of Thomas's personality intact to make the betrayal believable, while stripping away his ability to resist the commands that drove him to lead the hunters to their targets. Maya tried to share this insight with Vasa through the connection that bound them in the duel, but the vampire's pain was too deep and too old to be easily dislodged by rational explanation. Vessa's fury struck back like a hurricane of razor-sharp memories, showing Maya every moment of loss and betrayal that had followed that terrible night. Every vampire who had died because they trusted humans. Every attempt at cooperation that had ended in slaughter and heartbreak. Maya felt herself being overwhelmed by the sheer weight of supernatural trauma, her human consciousness struggling to process centuries of accumulated anguish that threatened to drown her in despair and rage. But instead of fighting against Vyasa's pain, Maya chose to embrace it, opening her heart to the vampire's suffering and allowing it to flow through her without resistance, understanding that the only way to heal such wounds was to acknowledge their reality without being destroyed by their intensity. The battle of wills became a form of psychological therapy conducted through supernatural combat, with Maya using empathy as her primary weapon, while Vyasa struck with centuries of accumulated pain and rage that had been festering like an infected wound in her soul. Maya began to understand that Vyasa's hatred was not really about humans at all, but about her own guilt over failing to save Thomas from the possession that had destroyed him, her anger at herself for not recognizing the signs of magical domination that might have prevented the massacre if she had acted sooner. Through careful questioning and gentle persistence, Maya helped Vyasa remember the love that had existed before the tragedy, the genuine connection that had made Thomas willing to risk everything for the sake of supernatural human cooperation, the research notes filled with dreams of healing that had been corrupted into instruments of destruction by forces neither of them had understood. The memories began to shift as Vessa's certainty cracked under the weight of Maya's compassion, revealing details that grief and rage had previously obscured, signs that Thomas had tried to warn her about strange dreams and gaps in his memory that had begun appearing weeks before the final betrayal. Maya watched Vessa's worldview reshape itself around new understanding, the vampire's perfect hatred giving way to more complex emotions that included grief for the human she had loved and lost, anger at the true enemy who had manipulated them both, and something that might have been hope that not all human-vampire bonds were doomed to end in tragedy. The duel's climax came not through violence, but through Vessa's grudging admission that perhaps her hatred had blinded her to possibilities that deserved consideration. Her surrender offered not in defeat but in exhaustion at carrying such enormous pain for so many centuries. Maya's victory felt hollow, because it had come at the cost of forcing Vessa to relive her worst trauma. But she also sensed that the vampire was finally ready to begin healing from wounds that had been carefully preserved in the amber of perpetual rage. As the dueling realm dissolved around them, returning them to the physical world of the vampire court, Vessa looked at Maya with eyes that held wariness, but no longer burned with implacable hatred. "Perhaps," the vampire said quietly, "there are truths I have been too afraid to examine," and Maya understood that the real work of healing was just beginning for both of them. Vasa's recovered memories revealed a truth more disturbing than anyone in the vampire court had imagined. The realization that the witch who had possessed Thomas was not only still alive, but had been systematically destroying supernatural communities for 2 centuries, using their own bonds of love and trust as weapons against them. The witch's name was Morwen Blackheart, and her campaign of genocide had been so subtle and far-reaching that most supernatural beings attributed the increasing isolation of their communities to natural evolution rather than deliberate assault. Maya listened with growing horror as Vyasa described the pattern she could now see clearly. How communities that had once cooperated across species lines had gradually withdrawn into fearful isolation. How bonds between supernatural beings and humans had become increasingly rare and dangerous. How the very concept of trust between worlds had been poisoned by repeated betrayals that followed identical patterns. The vampire court's isolation had not been paranoid overreaction, but necessary survival strategy against an enemy who specialized in turning love into a weapon and compassion into a gateway for destruction. Minister Blackthorn confirmed Vessa's revelations with records that painted an even more chilling picture. Documentation of supernatural communities across the globe that had been decimated by betrayals that always followed the same template. A trusted human ally would suddenly turn against their supernatural friends, leading hunters or other enemies to hidden sanctuaries with devastating effectiveness. The pattern was so consistent that it could not possibly be coincidence, and Maya realized that Morwen had been conducting a centuries-long experiment in supernatural extinction, perfecting her techniques of possession and manipulation while remaining hidden from her victims until it was too late to mount effective resistance. King Alexander's expression grew increasingly grim as the scope of the threat became clear. Understanding that his court's progressive policies had inadvertently made them prime targets for an enemy who viewed any cooperation between species as an abomination to be eliminated. Maya felt sick as she contemplated the implications, realizing that her presence in the vampire court might have drawn Morwen's attention to a community that had successfully hidden from the witch's notice for decades. Her good intentions potentially exposing people she had grown to love to dangers they had carefully avoided through isolation and secrecy. The witch's appearance in the court's great hall came without warning, reality simply folding to accommodate her presence like fabric being manipulated by invisible hands. And Maya's first glimpse of Morwen Blackheart revealed a figure of terrible beauty, whose perfection felt wrong in ways that made her teeth ache. Morwen appeared to be a young woman in her 20s, with alabaster skin and hair the color of fresh blood. But her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries spent perfecting the art of causing pain, and her smile promised suffering beyond imagination. She moved through the assembled vampires like a predator among prey, her very presence causing even the eldest court members to step back in recognition of power that transcended normal supernatural hierarchies. And Maya understood that she was facing something that had moved so far beyond human or vampire categories that normal rules no longer applied. "I have come to collect what is mine," Morwen announced, her voice carrying harmonies that hurt to hear and made reality shimmer around the edges. "The little healer whose blood carries such interesting properties belongs to me now, and you will surrender her or watch your precious court burn as so many others have burned before it." Maya felt the weight of supernatural attention focusing on her like a physical pressure. Understanding that whatever made her capable of breaking Damien's curse had also marked her as valuable to forces that viewed healing as just another form of power to be exploited or destroyed. Morwen's explanation sent chills through the assembled vampires, as she revealed that Maya's compassion was not simply personality trait, but genetic rarity, a bloodline gift that made her capable of breaking supernatural bonds and curses permanently through the application of genuine selfless love. This power made her invaluable as an ally, but devastating as an enemy's tool, and Maya realized that her defense of Damien had been like lighting a beacon that drew the attention of predators she had never imagined existed. The witch's offer was as cruel as it was straightforward. Surrender Maya for ritual sacrifice, and she would lift all her curses on the vampire lines, freeing them from generations of magical constraints that had weakened their abilities and shortened their lives. Refuse, and she would turn Maya's healing abilities into a weapon that would slowly drain the life force of every vampire she had touched, starting with Damien and spreading through the court like a supernatural plague that would leave them all withered husks of their former selves. King Alexander faced an impossible choice between protecting Maya and saving his people. The weight of responsibility for thousands of vampires balanced against his gratitude to the human who had saved both his son and his own life. Maya watched the king struggle with the decision, seeing how the burden of leadership forced him to consider options that violated every principle he held dear, and she realized that the choice should not be his to make because the power in question belonged to her rather than the court that had offered her sanctuary. The knowledge that her presence endangered everyone she had come to care about felt like a weight crushing her chest. But Maya also understood that running or hiding would only delay the inevitable confrontation with an enemy who had spent centuries perfecting the art of hunting people like her. Morwen's patient smile suggested that she was enjoying the internal conflict her ultimatum had created, feeding on the despair and impossible choices that her presence forced on her victims. And Maya felt a spark of anger kindle in her chest at the casual cruelty of someone who turned love itself into a weapon. Maya's proposal shocked everyone in the court into stunned silence, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade as she addressed Morwen directly rather than allowing others to negotiate for her fate. "Instead of running or hiding, I want to face you directly," Maya announced, her medical training giving her the confidence to speak to a supernatural predator as if she were addressing a particularly difficult patient. "But not as your victim or weapon, I want to try healing you instead, because I think your corruption is a symptom rather than your true nature." The witch's laughter was like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind, her amusement at such audacity almost drowning out the underlying note of surprise that Maya's trained ear detected in the sound. Morwen had clearly expected fear or desperate bargaining, not a treatment plan delivered with clinical detachment, and her momentary confusion gave Maya the opening she needed to continue explaining her theory. Through research in the court's ancient library during the 3 weeks between Vasa's challenge and the Blood Moon duel, Maya had discovered references to a healer named Morwen Brightheart, who had worked with both humans and supernatural creatures during the early days of European colonization. Her gifts used to bridge the gap between magical and mundane medicine in ways that saved countless lives. The corruption that had transformed Brightheart into Blackheart was not natural evolution, but the result of systematic torture designed to invert her healing abilities. Vampire hunters and church officials working together to turn her compassion into a weapon that could be used against the supernatural communities she had once protected. Maya's voice grew stronger as she outlined what she had learned. How Morwen's hatred stemmed from being forced to watch her healing touch become a tool for genocide. How centuries of being used as a weapon against innocent people had eventually broken something fundamental in her spirit that normal healing could not repair. The plan Maya proposed was unprecedented in its audacity and danger, requiring her to willingly allow Morwen to drain her healing essence while simultaneously using modern medical techniques to repair the spiritual damage in the witch's soul, a process that had never been attempted because it required the healer to risk complete power loss or death. Maya's medical knowledge had shown her that corruption of this magnitude required addressing both symptoms and root causes, treating the magical damage while also healing the psychological trauma that sustained it. But she knew that the process would require her to make herself completely vulnerable to someone who had spent centuries perfecting the art of causing pain. Damien's objection came immediately and passionately, his fear for Maya's safety overriding political considerations, as he argued that her plan was just another form of sacrifice that would take her away from him permanently. Maya understood his terror because she shared it. But she also knew that hiding behind the protection of others was not a sustainable solution when Morwen's threat extended far beyond their small circle to encompass every supernatural community that had ever tried to cooperate with humans. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most difficult of Maya's life, as she tried to help Damien understand that sometimes courage meant trusting the people you love to make dangerous choices, just as she had trusted him to reveal his true nature despite not knowing what that revelation might cost her. Maya reminded him of his own words about seeing her as more than her limitations, pointing out that trying to protect her from all danger was another form of limiting her agency and reducing her to someone who needed constant protection rather than someone capable of making informed decisions about acceptable risks. She explained that her medical training had prepared her to face dangerous situations in service of healing others, that her choice to attempt treating Morwen was not reckless self-sacrifice, but calculated risk based on genuine belief that she possessed both the knowledge and skills necessary to succeed where others had failed. Damien's eventual acceptance came hard, tinged with the understanding that loving someone sometimes meant stepping back and allowing them to follow paths that terrified you, trusting that their judgment and abilities were sufficient to carry them through challenges you could not face for them. The vampire court's reaction to Maya's plan was mixed, with traditionalists viewing it as further proof that human involvement inevitably led to disaster, while progressives saw it as the ultimate test of whether cooperation between species could overcome even the most entrenched opposition. King Alexander's approval carried the weight of absolute authority, but also deep personal concern. His gratitude to Maya, balanced against his responsibility to protect someone who had become precious to his family and his people. Minister Blackthorn provided crucial support by helping Maya gather the supplies she would need, combining ancient vampire healing artifacts with modern medical equipment in ways that had never been attempted but that theoretical research suggested might be effective. The preparation process revealed how much Maya had learned about supernatural physiology during her time in the court, her growing understanding of how magical and biological systems interacted, allowing her to design treatment protocols that addressed both aspects of Morwen's condition. As the time for departure approached, Maya found herself saying goodbye to people who had become family in ways she had never expected. The vampire court feeling more like home than her own apartment, despite the obvious differences in lifestyle and species. Vice's farewell was particularly meaningful, the former enemy offering grudging respect for Maya's courage, while also providing warnings about Morwen's specific capabilities based on her own painful experience with the witch's powers. The final moments before leaving were spent with Damien, their bond allowing them to share emotions too complex for words, as Maya prepared to walk into danger that could separate them permanently or transform her into something he might not recognize. The ancient vampire healing artifacts felt heavy in Maya's medical bag as she walked alone toward Morwen's lair, their weight representing centuries of accumulated wisdom about supernatural healing, balanced against modern understanding of psychology and medicine, the combination offering hope for success, where either approach alone would certainly fail. Maya's last thought before entering the witch's domain was not of her own safety, but of all the people whose lives could be saved if she succeeded in breaking the cycle of corruption and hatred that had poisoned supernatural human relations for generations, understanding that healing Morwen meant healing wounds that extended far beyond any individual victim. Morwen's domain existed in a space that defied natural law, a twisted reflection of a medieval hospital where the very architecture seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and every surface bore the stain of healing gifts corrupted beyond recognition. Maya stepped through the threshold between realities, feeling the temperature drop several degrees as she entered a realm where the fundamental laws of medicine had been inverted, where plants grew in impossible spirals that drained life force rather than nourishing it, and where fountains flowed with waters that promised healing, but delivered only poison to those desperate enough to drink. The walls were lined with beds that contained patients who existed in states between life and death, their forms shifting constantly as Morwen's corrupted power kept them suspended in eternal suffering, neither allowing them to heal nor granting them the mercy of final rest. Maya's medical training helped her recognize the symptoms of what she was witnessing as a form of spiritual infection, a corruption so profound that it had rewritten the basic principles of healing magic and turned every instrument of mercy into a tool of exquisite torment. The witch stood at the center of her domain, like a queen surveying her kingdom of suffering, her beauty still terrible in its perfection, but now clearly revealed as a mask worn by something that had forgotten how to be human in any meaningful sense. Morwen's smile promised pain beyond imagination as she gestured for Maya to enter more fully into her realm, her voice carrying harmonies that made the air itself seem to writhe in discomfort as she spoke. "Welcome to my sanctuary, little healer," she said, "where I have perfected the art of turning compassion into cruelty, and where you will learn that every gift can become a curse with the proper application of will." Maya forced herself to walk deeper into the twisted hospital, despite every instinct screaming at her to flee, her medical bag feeling inadequate against the supernatural horrors surrounding her, but also serving as an anchor to her identity as someone who healed rather than harmed. The witch began testing Maya immediately through a series of psychological torments designed to break her spirit before the physical healing process could even begin, projecting visions directly into her mind that showed all the ways her healing gifts could be perverted if Morwen chose to corrupt her as she had been corrupted centuries ago. Maya saw herself forced to harm rather than heal, her hands becoming instruments of torture as she was compelled to use her medical knowledge to prolong suffering rather than alleviate it. Her compassion turned into a weapon against everyone she had ever tried to protect. The visions showed her family writhing in agony while she stood helpless to help them, Damien screaming as her touch drained his life force instead of strengthening it, the vampire court falling into madness as her corrupted healing spread through their bonds like a supernatural plague. But Maya's scientific background gave her an advantage that Morwen had not expected, allowing her to approach the corruption analytically rather than emotionally, studying the visions like symptoms to be diagnosed rather than threats to be feared. Where others might see evil magic beyond comprehension, Maya recognized patterns that spoke of trauma manifesting through supernatural channels, psychological wounds that had metastasized into magical corruption because they had never been properly treated. She began responding to Morwen's torments not with terror or rage, but with clinical questions about symptoms and duration, her medical training automatically cataloging the signs of spiritual damage, even as her conscious mind reeled from the intensity of the witch's pain. "Tell me about the first time you realized your healing had been corrupted," Maya said, her voice steady despite the supernatural horrors surrounding her. "And how did the physical symptoms manifest in relation to your emotional state during the initial trauma?" Morwen's expression shifted from predatory satisfaction to confusion as she realized that Maya was treating her like a patient rather than cowering before her like a victim, the witch's carefully constructed scenarios of intimidation falling apart when met with genuine clinical interest instead of the fear and hatred she had expected. Maya continued her medical assessment despite the increasingly frantic nature of Morwen's attacks, asking about pain levels and triggers with the same professional detachment she would use with any patient, her approach confusing and enraging the witch who had expected to feed on terror rather than being subjected to therapeutic intervention. The questions began revealing cracks in Morwen's perfect hatred as she found herself answering despite her intention to cause only suffering, her responses providing Maya with the clinical data she needed to understand exactly what kind of damage she was dealing with and how it might be reversed through proper treatment. Maya noted how Morwen's corruption intensified when she spoke about healing others, how her beautiful features contorted with pain whenever she remembered what it felt like to cure rather than cause suffering, and how her supernatural abilities fluctuated in response to emotional triggers related to trust and vulnerability. The witch's domain began to shift around them as Morwen's emotional state changed, the twisted hospital becoming less stable as its creator found herself forced to examine wounds she had spent centuries avoiding. And Maya understood that the healing process had already begun, whether Morwen wanted it or not. Through careful questioning and patient observation, Maya began piecing together the true story of Morwen Blackheart's transformation from healer to destroyer, understanding that the witch's current identity was built on foundations of trauma so profound that her entire magical nature had been rewritten by the experience. The woman standing before her had once been Morwen Brightheart, a gifted healer who had worked with both humans and supernatural creatures during the 16th century, when such cooperation was not only possible but actively encouraged by progressive elements in both communities. Maya learned that Brightheart had been renowned for her ability to bridge the gap between magical and mundane medicine, using supernatural techniques to enhance surgical procedures and combining herbal knowledge with vampire regenerative abilities to create treatments that surpassed anything either tradition could achieve alone. Her medical practice had served as a sanctuary where humans and supernatural beings could receive care without prejudice or fear. Her reputation for compassion and skill, drawing patients from across Europe who trusted her with secrets that could have cost them their lives in less understanding hands. The vampire hunters who eventually captured her had been working in conjunction with church officials who viewed any cooperation between human and supernatural healers as heretical contamination that threatened the natural order. Their campaign against mixed healing practices, part of a broader effort to drive supernatural beings back into complete isolation from human society. Maya's clinical training helped her recognize the sophisticated nature of the torture that had broken Morwen's mind, understanding that her captors had specifically targeted her healing abilities rather than simply trying to cause physical pain or extract information. They had forced her to use her gifts in reverse, compelling her to cause agony instead of relief, and to create sickness instead of health, turning every instinct toward compassion into a source of unbearable guilt and self-loathing. The most devastating aspect of her torture had been the cyclical nature of the abuse, where Morwen was forced to heal her fellow prisoners just enough to allow their torture to continue, her greatest joy becoming the instrument of their prolonged suffering until she could no longer distinguish between healing and harming. Maya realized that Morwen's corruption was not evil in any theological sense, but rather the magical equivalent of a severe psychological disorder, a trauma response that had metastasized over centuries because supernatural healing methods had no framework for treating spiritual wounds that manifested as magical pathology. The witch's attacks on supernatural communities were not motivated by simple malice, but represented attempts to eliminate the source of her pain by destroying anything that reminded her of what she had lost. Her unconscious mind, believing that if no supernatural beings existed, then she could never again be forced to harm them. Using a combination of modern therapeutic techniques and the supernatural healing methods she had learned from the vampire court, Maya began the delicate process of helping Morwen remember who she had been before the corruption took hold, understanding that recovery would require her to take some of the witch's pain into herself to prevent it from overwhelming Morwen's fragile psyche during the healing process. The first breakthrough came when Maya helped Morwen access memories from before her capture, guiding her back to the simple joy she had once felt when successfully treating a patient, the pure satisfaction of using her gifts to alleviate suffering rather than cause it. But the process was dangerous for Maya as well, each recovered memory bringing with it echoes of the torture that had followed, centuries of accumulated pain flowing through their connection and threatening to corrupt her own healing abilities if she allowed herself to be overwhelmed by the intensity of Morwen's trauma. Maya found herself experiencing flashes of being forced to cause pain with her own hands, feeling the phantom sensation of her healing touch becoming an instrument of torture, understanding on a visceral level how such experiences could drive someone to madness if they had no framework for processing the psychological damage. The healing sessions became increasingly intense as Morwen's suppressed memories fought against centuries of carefully constructed defenses, her corrupted magic lashing out instinctively against anything that threatened to destabilize the hatred that had become her primary coping mechanism. Maya had to maintain her own sanity while gradually drawing out the poison that had infected every aspect of Morwen's supernatural nature, using her medical knowledge to understand how spiritual wounds manifested physically and treating symptoms while addressing root causes with a precision that purely magical healing could not achieve. Damien and the vampire court could sense Maya's distress across their mystical bond, but were powerless to intervene without disrupting the delicate healing process, their anguish at watching her suffer serving as a reminder that love sometimes meant allowing the people you cared about to face dangers you could not share. Maya knew that she was walking a razor's edge between healing and corruption, understanding that if she absorbed too much of Morwen's trauma without properly processing it, she might find her own gifts turned against those she wanted to protect. But she also knew that this was the only chance to break a cycle of pain that had poisoned supernatural human relations for centuries. The healing process became a dangerous dance where Maya had to maintain perfect balance between empathy and detachment, opening herself enough to draw out Morwen's corruption while protecting her own psyche from being overwhelmed by centuries of accumulated trauma and rage. She used her medical knowledge to understand how spiritual wounds manifested physically, noting how Morwen's corrupted magic created actual changes in her physiology that went beyond simple magical transformation, her body bearing the scars of torture that had occurred centuries ago, but remained as fresh as if they had been inflicted yesterday. Maya began treating these physical symptoms alongside the spiritual damage, using conventional medical techniques to address manifestations of trauma, while simultaneously working with supernatural healing methods to repair the magical pathways that had been twisted into instruments of harm rather than healing. The breakthrough came when Maya helped Morwen remember the first patient she had ever saved, a young vampire child who had been abandoned by both human and supernatural communities after being turned accidentally during a plague outbreak, too young to understand what had happened to him and too frightened to control his new abilities. Maya watched through their shared connection as the memory unfolded, seeing how Brightheart had found the child hiding in the ruins of his family's home, starving because he didn't know how to feed safely and terrified of the bloodlust that overwhelmed him whenever he encountered living creatures. The healing that Brightheart had performed was not just medical, but emotional, teaching the child how to control his vampire nature, while also helping him process the grief of losing his human family and identity, creating a safe space where he could learn to accept what he had become without losing his essential humanity. Maya realized that this memory held the key to Morwen's corruption. Understanding that the witch's hatred of vampires stemmed not from the torture she had endured, but from survivor's guilt over the supernatural creatures she had been unable to save when her captors forced her to betray their trust. The vampire child had been among those brought to her during her imprisonment, his innocent face twisted with confusion as she was compelled to use her healing touch to prolong his suffering rather than ease it, and the memory of his betrayed trust had become the core around which all her subsequent corruption had crystallized. Maya helped Morwen understand that the child's death was not her fault, but the responsibility of those who had perverted her gifts, that her healing had been corrupted against her will rather than chosen, and that the centuries of self-hatred she had carried were based on guilt that belonged to her torturers rather than herself. As this understanding took hold, Morwen's corrupted magic began to reverse itself, the twisted hospital realm around them slowly transforming back into something that resembled a place of healing rather than torment. The plants that had drained life began to bloom with genuine vitality, The poisoned waters cleared into fountains that offered real refreshment, and the patients suspended between life and death finally found peace as Morwen's unconscious need to perpetuate suffering gave way to her original desire to heal and comfort those in pain. But the transformation came at a terrible cost to Maya, whose healing abilities had been severely depleted by the process of drawing out centuries of corruption, her own life force diminished by the effort of processing trauma that had accumulated far beyond anything one person should be expected to bear. She had absorbed some of Morwen's memories along with her pain, carrying within herself echoes of torture and betrayal that would require years of careful healing to fully integrate without being destroyed by their intensity. Maya found herself experiencing flashbacks to events she had never lived through, phantom pains from wounds that had been inflicted on someone else, and a deep understanding of how healing gifts could be perverted that made her question whether her own abilities were truly safe from corruption. Morwen, now restored to something approaching her original nature as Brightheart, was horrified by the centuries of evil acts she had committed while lost in corruption. Her memories of destroying supernatural communities and turning love into a weapon, causing her to collapse with grief that threatened to undo all the healing Maya had accomplished. The witch fell to her knees in the transformed space that had once been her domain of suffering, her perfect beauty now expressing genuine remorse rather than predatory hunger, her voice breaking as she tried to apologize for damage that could never be fully repaired. Maya knelt beside her, understanding that Morwen's horror at her own actions was a healthy response that indicated successful healing, even though the emotional pain of recovery was almost as intense as the original trauma had been. Morwen offered to transfer all her remaining magical power to Maya as compensation for the damage the healing process had caused, her desire to make amends overwhelming her concern for her own supernatural abilities. But Maya refused the transfer with gentle firmness. Instead, she proposed that they work together to heal the damage that had been done to supernatural communities over the centuries, using Morwen's restored abilities and Maya's medical knowledge to create new methods of treatment that could address both magical and psychological trauma in ways that neither tradition had been able to achieve alone. The alliance between former enemies represented a new beginning for supernatural healing, the possibility that the wounds inflicted by centuries of mistrust and manipulation could finally be addressed through cooperation rather than isolation, and Maya felt hope kindle in her chest despite the exhaustion and trauma that the healing process had cost her. Morwen's acceptance of the partnership marked the end of her identity as Blackheart and the beginning of her journey back toward the healer she had once been, her corruption finally broken by the same compassion that had originally defined her gifts. And Maya understood that their work together would require both of them to remain vigilant against the forces that sought to turn healing into harm. Maya's return to the vampire court, accompanied by the woman who now called herself Brightheart rather than Blackheart, created a tension so thick it seemed to crystallize in the air around them, the assembled vampires reacting to Morwen's presence with a mixture of barely controlled rage, profound suspicion, and something that might have been hope tempered by centuries of justified paranoia. King Alexander stood at the center of the great hall surrounded by his advisors, his expression carefully neutral as he studied the transformed witch, whose very existence challenged everything the vampire court had believed about the permanence of supernatural corruption and the impossibility of redemption for those who had committed atrocities beyond normal comprehension. Many of the elder vampires called for immediate execution, their voices rising in harmonious discord as they recounted the communities that had been destroyed by Morwen's machinations, the bonds that had been perverted into weapons, the trust that had been shattered so completely that entire species had retreated into isolation rather than risk further betrayal. Lady Vessa stood among those calling for justice, but her voice carried undertones of uncertainty that had not been present before her own healing. Her recent experience with recovering suppressed memories making her question whether punishment was always the appropriate response to acts committed under the influence of trauma-induced corruption. Minister Blackthorne argued for the unprecedented opportunity that Morwen's restoration represented, pointing out that her knowledge of supernatural communities across the globe could provide invaluable intelligence about the scope of damage that needed to be healed and the locations of isolated groups who might be willing to participate in reconstruction efforts if approached with proper understanding and respect. Maya found herself serving as translator between worldviews that had grown so far apart they barely shared common assumptions about the nature of justice, healing, and the possibility of redemption for those who had caused immeasurable suffering while trapped in cycles of trauma that predated their conscious choices. She explained to the vampires how her medical training had taught her to distinguish between symptoms and root causes, how treating Morwen's corruption had revealed that the witch's actions stemmed from psychological damage rather than inherent evil, and how the healing process had demonstrated that even the most profound spiritual wounds could be addressed if approached with appropriate knowledge and technique. The court's debate revealed fractures that went beyond simple disagreement about Morwen's fate, touching on fundamental questions about whether vampire society should continue its isolation or risk the vulnerabilities that came with integration, whether ancient certainties could be questioned without destroying the traditions that had preserved their culture through centuries of persecution, and whether humans could ever truly be trusted with supernatural secrets, given the long history of betrayal and violence that had shaped both communities. Maya discovered that her experience healing Morwen had changed her in ways that went far beyond simple exhaustion, her consciousness now carrying traces of the witch's accumulated knowledge, along with fragments of trauma that belonged to someone else's history, but felt as real as her own memories. She found herself waking from nightmares about torture she had never experienced, her dreams filled with the screams of supernatural beings who had died centuries before her birth, her healing abilities now enhanced by techniques that should not exist in the modern world, but came to her hands as naturally as breathing. The integration of foreign knowledge and traumatic memory created a disorientation that Maya struggled to process through normal therapeutic methods, understanding that she was dealing with spiritual changes that had no equivalent in conventional psychology or medicine. Transformations that required her to redefine her sense of self while maintaining enough stability to continue functioning in both human and supernatural contexts. Damien proved invaluable in helping her navigate these changes. His own experience of having his identity shaped by supernatural forces beyond his control, providing a framework for understanding how to accept transformation while maintaining essential core values and relationships. Their bond deepened as they learned to support each other through changes neither had chosen, but both were required to integrate. Maya's absorption of Morwen's memories, creating parallels with Damien's recovery from the curse that had defined his existence for centuries, both of them discovering that healing often involved becoming someone new, rather than simply returning to a previous state. The conversations they shared during Maya's recovery period revealed how much their relationship had evolved beyond the mystical connection created by breaking his curse. Their love now based on mutual recognition of strength and vulnerability, rather than gratitude or supernatural compulsion. Two people who had chosen each other despite the complications that came with bridging different worlds and the responsibilities that their unique positions entailed. Morwen's integration into the court community proved almost as challenging as her original healing had been. The witch struggling with guilt over centuries of actions committed while corrupted, and finding herself overwhelmed by the trust that some vampires were willing to extend, despite their knowledge of what she had done to their communities. Her knowledge of supernatural society's hidden networks became invaluable as the court began planning responses to the isolation and mistrust that her corruption had helped create. But accessing those memories often triggered episodes where she became lost in the trauma of her original capture and torture, requiring Maya's continued intervention to maintain her psychological stability. The alliance between former enemies became a model for the kind of cooperation that might be possible on a larger scale. demonstrating that even the most entrenched conflicts could be addressed through proper understanding of their psychological and historical roots, but also revealing the enormous amount of work required to heal wounds that had been festering for centuries without appropriate treatment. Morwen's restored memories revealed the true scope of supernatural society's hidden networks, painting a picture of communities that had once maintained complex relationships across species lines, but had gradually withdrawn into fearful isolation as her corruption spread mistrust and paranoia throughout their interconnected systems of cooperation and mutual support. Maya learned that werewolf packs had once served as messengers and guardians for vampire courts, that Fae communities had provided magical assistance for human healers working with supernatural patients, and that elemental spirits had helped maintain the balance between natural and constructed environments in ways that benefited both human cities and supernatural sanctuaries. The revelation that so many different types of supernatural beings existed in hiding around the world both thrilled and overwhelmed Maya, understanding that her success in healing one witch represented just the beginning of addressing damage that extended across continents and affected dozens of species whose names she was only beginning to learn. Morwen's knowledge included not just the locations of isolated communities, but detailed information about the specific traumas and conflicts that had driven each group into seclusion, the particular betrayals and attacks that had convinced them cooperation with other species was too dangerous to risk, and the cultural changes that had occurred as survival-focused isolation gradually became accepted as the natural order rather than a temporary defensive measure. Maya proposed something that had never been attempted in recorded supernatural history, a gathering where representatives from all supernatural communities could meet with selected human allies to address the wounds left by centuries of separation and conflict, understanding that her success in healing Morwen had proven that redemption was possible, but only if all parties were willing to participate in the difficult work of rebuilding trust. King Alexander agreed to host the unprecedented council, despite strong opposition from traditionalist factions who viewed any expansion of supernatural cooperation as an invitation to the kind of catastrophic betrayal that had originally driven their people into hiding. His decision, based on recognition that continued isolation was slowly weakening vampire society through cultural stagnation and genetic bottlenecking that threatened their long-term survival. The preparation process for what became known as the Council of Three Worlds revealed depths of dysfunction in supernatural society that had been hidden even from its own members. Ancient feuds between werewolf packs and vampire clans that had their origins in misunderstandings about territorial boundaries. Conflicts between urban fae who had adapted to technological environments and rural elementals who viewed such adaptation as cultural contamination, and communication barriers that had developed as different species evolved separate languages and customs during their centuries of isolation. Maya realized that her role had evolved far beyond healing individuals to become something like a supernatural social worker, using her human perspective and medical training to identify patterns of dysfunction that supernatural beings had accepted as normal because they lacked external frameworks for recognizing how their isolation had distorted their social development. Her medical background proved invaluable in understanding how prolonged isolation affected supernatural psychology, recognizing symptoms of community-level trauma that manifested as increased aggression, difficulty forming new relationships, and resistance to change that went beyond normal cultural conservatism to become pathological attachment to familiar patterns, regardless of their effectiveness. The months of preparation required to bring together representatives from dozens of supernatural communities tested Maya's diplomatic skills almost as much as her medical knowledge, each species requiring different approaches and assurances before they would agree to participate in something that violated centuries of carefully maintained secrecy and suspicion. Maya found herself traveling between hidden werewolf territories in national forests and urban fae enclaves that existed in the spaces between human perception, learning to communicate with elemental spirits who thought in geological timescales and negotiate with vampire courts whose political structures had fossilized around conflicts that predated modern human civilization. Her growing understanding of supernatural diversity, making her appreciate both the complexity of the challenges they faced and the potential benefits of successful cooperation. The Council of Three Worlds convened in the Vampire Court's Great Hall, which had been expanded through collaborative magic that demonstrated the potential for supernatural cooperation, even as it created a space large enough to accommodate representatives from dozens of communities whose members had not gathered in the same location for centuries. Maya stood at the center of the transformed space, feeling the weight of supernatural attention like a physical presence, understanding that she had become both symbol and catalyst for changes that would either strengthen the hidden communities or destroy them through exposure to conflicts they had spent generations avoiding. The assembled representatives created a tapestry of diversity that strained human comprehension, werewolf pack leaders sitting alongside vampire nobles, urban fae, whose appearance shifted constantly between human and something altogether other, sharing space with elemental spirits whose forms seemed to be made from living water and controlled fire, each delegation bringing not just their species' particular perspective, but centuries of accumulated grievances and suspicions that threatened to derail negotiations before they could properly begin. Maya served as both healer and mediator during the 3-day gathering, moving between groups to facilitate conversations that required her to translate not just languages, but entire worldviews that had developed in isolation from each other, helping werewolves understand why vampires viewed pack loyalty as potential threat to individual autonomy, while explaining to vampire nobles why werewolf emphasis on collective decision-making was strength rather than weakness. The most challenging mediation involved territorial disputes that had festered for generations without resolution, because the affected communities had no neutral arbitrator capable of understanding both supernatural law and practical geography, conflicts over hunting grounds, and sanctuary boundaries that had escalated into blood feuds, despite the fact that careful negotiation could have created sharing arrangements beneficial to all parties involved. Maya's medical training proved invaluable in recognizing how these conflicts followed patterns similar to family dysfunction, where communication had broken down so completely that each side interpreted the other's actions through filters of assumption and past trauma rather than current reality, requiring interventions that addressed both practical concerns and underlying emotional wounds before sustainable agreements could be reached. The Council's most significant achievement was the creation of what became known as the New Covenant, a set of principles for supernatural human cooperation that protected both communities' needs for secrecy and autonomy, while establishing frameworks for limited collaboration on concerns that affected both groups, such as environmental protection, medical research, and defense against threats that targeted supernatural beings specifically. Maya's expertise proved crucial in establishing protocols that would allow supernatural beings to access human healthcare when their own traditional methods proved insufficient, creating referral networks that respected both medical ethics and supernatural secrecy, while providing treatment options for conditions that bridged physical and magical realms in ways that neither purely human nor purely supernatural medicine could address effectively. Her experience with trauma helped create support systems for supernatural beings dealing with centuries of isolation-induced psychological damage, establishing counseling resources that combined modern therapeutic techniques with supernatural healing methods to address mental health issues that had been ignored or misunderstood by communities that lacked frameworks for recognizing how prolonged secrecy affected individual and collective well-being. The new covenant also established emergency cooperation protocols for situations involving threats to supernatural communities, creating communication networks that could coordinate responses to hunters, hostile magic users, or government agencies that discovered supernatural secrets without being properly prepared to handle such knowledge responsibly and ethically. But not all representatives accepted the new covenant's vision of increased cooperation. A significant faction of traditionalists from multiple species, forming an opposition alliance that viewed any collaboration with humans as cultural contamination that would inevitably destroy the essential natures that made supernatural communities worth preserving in the first place. These opponents argued that Maya's success in healing Morwen was an anomaly rather than a precedent, that human compassion was too rare and unreliable to justify the risks that came with trusting mortals with supernatural secrets, and that the proposed cooperation would eventually lead to exploitation and betrayal, just as it had in previous centuries, when similar attempts at integration had ended in genocide and persecution. The formation of the Purist Alliance created a shadow organization dedicated to undermining the new covenant through any means necessary, their membership including some of the oldest and most powerful supernatural beings whose influence extended across multiple communities and whose opposition threatened to tear apart the fragile agreements that had been achieved through months of careful negotiation and compromise. The Purist Alliance struck without warning across multiple continents simultaneously, their coordinated attacks targeting supernatural beings who had signed the new covenant and humans who had been trusted with supernatural secrets, creating a campaign of terror designed to prove that cooperation between species inevitably led to betrayal and destruction. Maya learned of the first attacks through frantic communications that reached the vampire court in the early hours of dawn. Reports of werewolf pack leaders found dead with silver bullets inscribed with anti-integration slogans, Fey sanctuaries burned by magical fire that left no traces for human investigators, and progressive vampire nobles discovered drained of blood in rituals that perverted their own feeding practices into weapons of execution. The Alliance's message was clear and brutal in its simplicity. Supernatural beings who contaminated themselves through human contact would be purified through death, while humans who possessed forbidden knowledge would be eliminated before they could spread their infection to others. Maya became the Alliance's primary target, not just because of her role in creating the new covenant, but because her healing abilities represented everything they feared about human influence on supernatural nature. Her compassion viewed as a weapon that would eventually domesticate and destroy all magical beings by making them dependent on mortal understanding rather than their own ancient wisdom. The attacks escalated quickly from symbolic violence to systematic assassination attempts, magical traps appearing in places Maya frequented, supernatural predators tracking her scent through city streets, and corrupted healing artifacts designed to turn her own abilities against her if she tried to help their victims. The Alliance's leader revealed himself through a formal challenge delivered to King Alexander during a court session. The ancient vampire lord Cassius Draven, materializing in the Great Hall like a shadow, given malevolent form, his presence immediately recognizable to the older court members who remembered him as Alexander's rival for the throne centuries ago. Cassius had been in exile since losing the succession battle, spending his banishment gathering followers who shared his vision of supernatural purity, untainted by human weakness, building a network of traditionalists across multiple species who viewed the current integration efforts as existential threats to everything that made their communities worth preserving. His appearance in the vampire court represented a declaration of war that went beyond simple political opposition to become a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of Alexander's rule and the progressive policies that had defined his reign since claiming the throne. Maya realized with growing horror that her presence at court had painted a target on everyone she cared about, understanding that the Alliance viewed her not as an individual to be eliminated, but as a symbol whose very existence proved that supernatural society had been corrupted beyond redemption. The attacks would not stop with her death, but would extend to Damien for accepting human healing, to King Alexander for allowing human integration, to Minister Blackthorn for advocating cooperation, and to every supernatural being who had been touched by her influence or participated in the new covenant negotiations. The alliance's strategy was designed to create a cascade of fear that would drive supernatural communities back into complete isolation by demonstrating that any contact with humans inevitably led to persecution and death, turning Maya's compassion into a weapon against the very people she had tried to help. Cassius's followers included some of the oldest and most powerful supernatural beings from multiple species, vampires whose strength predated modern civilization, werewolf alphas who commanded packs spanning entire regions, phase nobles whose magic could reshape reality itself, and elemental spirits whose anger could manifest as natural disasters that would be attributed to climate change rather than supernatural warfare. Maya found herself facing enemies who possessed centuries of experience in violence and manipulation, beings whose power dwarfed anything she had encountered during her healing of Morwen. Understanding that her medical training and human compassion would be inadequate weapons against opponents who viewed her very humanity as an abomination to be erased from supernatural society. The realization that she had become the catalyst for a war she could not win filled Maya with despair that went beyond personal fear to encompass guilt over the suffering her good intentions had unleashed on communities that had trusted her with their secrets and safety. Damien's attempts to protect her only increased the danger to both of them, his royal status making him a particularly valuable target for enemies who wanted to demonstrate that even vampire nobility could not safely associate with humans without facing consequences that would destroy everything they claimed to value. The vampire court became a fortress under siege as ancient defensive protocols were activated for the first time in centuries, magical barriers rising around the Gothic halls while armed guards took positions that had not been needed since the wars that had driven supernatural society into hiding. The atmosphere of scholarly debate and cultural refinement giving way to the grim preparations of a community preparing for existential battle. Cassius's ultimatum arrived through channels that bypassed every defensive measure the vampire court had established, his message appearing simultaneously in Maya's dreams, written in fire across the walls of the great hall, and spoken by every reflection she encountered in mirrors and windows throughout the supernatural sanctuary. The ancient vampire's offer was as cruel as it was familiar, echoing the choice that Morwen had once presented, but carrying the added weight of demonstrated power and the promise of escalating violence if his demands were not met immediately and completely. Leave supernatural society forever and let us return to the pure isolation that preserved our people for millennia, Cassius commanded, his words carrying harmonics that made reality itself seem to shiver with malevolent intent. Or watch everyone you have contaminated with your mortal weakness suffer consequences that will make Morwen's corruption seem like gentle mercy. Maya understood that her human life had been irreparably changed by her supernatural experiences, the knowledge she had gained and the trauma she had absorbed, making it impossible to return to her medical studies and pretend ignorance of the magical world that existed alongside mundane reality. The nightmares from healing Morwen continued to plague her sleep, fragments of torture and betrayal that belonged to someone else's history, but felt as real as her own memories, while her enhanced healing abilities made normal medical practice feel inadequate and frustrating when she could sense supernatural solutions to problems that conventional medicine could not address. But staying in supernatural society meant accepting that she would always be a symbol of controversy whose very presence continuously endangered the people she was trying to help, her existence serving as a lightning rod for conflicts that might otherwise remain dormant in the careful balance between tradition and progress. Damien's pleas for her to remain carried the weight of genuine love and political necessity, his arguments that giving in to extremists only validated their hatred resonating with Maya's own instincts, while also forcing her to confront the reality that their relationship had become a weapon that could be used against both of them. The prince's growing desperation revealed how much he had come to depend not just on their mystical bond, but on her presence as an anchor to hope that supernatural society could evolve beyond the cycles of fear and isolation that had defined it for centuries. His fear of losing her extending beyond personal attachment to encompass terror that her departure would signal the failure of everything he had tried to build. King Alexander's offer surprised everyone in the court, including Maya herself, when he proposed to abdicate in favor of a joint human-vampire ruling council with Maya as the human representative, a constitutional innovation that would legitimize her place in their society permanently while sharing the burden of leadership in ways that could address both traditionalist concerns about human domination and progressive hopes for meaningful integration. The proposal represented a radical departure from vampire governance traditions that had remained unchanged for millennia, but it also offered a path forward that acknowledged the reality that supernatural society could no longer remain completely isolated without risking stagnation and eventual extinction through cultural and genetic bottlenecking. Maya realized that accepting such a role would transform her from healer to ruler, making her a political target forever, while forcing her to navigate supernatural politics that she barely understood, despite months of intensive education about vampire law and customs. The weight of responsibility that came with such power terrified her almost as much as the prospect of leaving Damien and the community that had become her second family. Understanding that ruling required different skills than healing and carried moral burdens that could corrupt even the most well-intentioned leaders if they were not constantly vigilant against the seductive nature of absolute authority. The choice between leaving and staying felt like a false dilemma that forced her to sacrifice either her safety or her principles. But Maya also understood that Cassius's ultimatum was designed to create exactly this kind of impossible situation, where any decision would result in outcomes that served the Alliance's goals of proving that human supernatural cooperation was doomed to failure. Maya's realization that the choice between staying and leaving represented a false dilemma came during a long night of meditation in the vampire court's ancient library, surrounded by texts that chronicled centuries of supernatural governance and the gradual evolution of political systems that had preserved their communities through periods of external persecution and internal strife. She understood that both options Cassius had presented served his goals of proving that humans could not safely integrate into supernatural society. Her departure demonstrating that mortals would eventually abandon their supernatural allies when faced with sufficient pressure, while her acceptance of permanent political power would confirm traditionalist fears about human domination and the corruption of ancient ways. Instead of choosing between the alternatives her enemies had constructed, Maya proposed a solution that addressed both traditionalist fears and progressive hopes through the creation of temporary leadership structures designed to establish sustainable systems that would not depend on any single person's continued presence or extraordinary abilities. Working with Morwen's restored wisdom about supernatural governance and Damien's detailed understanding of vampire law, Maya helped design a new form of political organization that protected essential traditions while allowing for controlled evolution, maintaining the secrecy that supernatural communities required for survival while enabling selective cooperation with humans who could be trusted with such knowledge. The system included constitutional restrictions on human influence that prevented any single mortal from accumulating the kind of power that traditionalists feared, while also creating mechanisms for supernatural communities to adapt their practices in response to changing circumstances without abandoning the core values and customs that defined their cultural identities. Maya's proposal included her acceptance of a temporary leadership role designed to last only long enough to establish the new governmental structures and train supernatural beings to manage human relations without requiring constant mortal mediation, her willingness to limit her own authority, demonstrating that she sought partnership rather than dominance over communities that had trusted her with their secrets. The final confrontation with Cassius took place not through violence, but through a formal debate before representatives of all supernatural communities who had participated in the Council of Three Worlds. The ancient vampire lord's challenge forcing Maya to defend not just her personal choices, but the entire philosophy of cooperation that had guided the new covenant negotiations. Maya argued that true strength came from the ability to grow and adapt in response to changing circumstances, pointing to the successful healing of Morwen and the productive exchanges between species that had already begun under the Covenant as evidence that supernatural communities could maintain their essential natures while still benefiting from carefully managed contact with human knowledge and perspective. Cassius represented the fear that any change inevitably led to corruption and eventual destruction. His position based on historical examples of supernatural communities that had been betrayed by human allies, and the reasonable concern that integration would eventually dilute the magical abilities and cultural practices that made their people unique and valuable. The debate revealed fundamental philosophical differences about the nature of purity and strength, with Maya advocating for dynamic preservation that allowed traditions to evolve while maintaining their core purposes, while Cassius defended static preservation that maintained traditional forms regardless of their continued effectiveness or relevance to contemporary challenges. Maya's victory came not through superior rhetoric, but through her voluntary acceptance of constitutional limitations on her own power, creating legal frameworks that restricted human influence in supernatural society, while still allowing for beneficial cooperation, demonstrating through concrete action that she sought partnership based on mutual respect rather than domination through superior numbers or political manipulation. The constitutional restrictions included term limits for human advisors, voting procedures that ensured supernatural beings retained control over decisions affecting their communities, and appeal mechanisms that allowed traditionalist voices to challenge policies they viewed as threatening to essential cultural values, creating a system of checks and balances that protected both progressive innovation and conservative stability. Cassius's surrender came when he realized that Maya's willingness to limit her own authority addressed the core fears driving traditionalist opposition. His acknowledgement that the proposed system offered genuine protection against human domination, while still allowing for the kind of controlled adaptation that might be necessary for supernatural society's long-term survival, marking the end of the Purist Alliance's coordinated resistance to integration efforts. 1 year after the constitutional crisis that had threatened to tear supernatural society apart, Maya stood in the renovated Nocturne Cafe, watching Damien help a young werewolf child practice controlling his transformation, while other supernatural beings and their human allies shared the space in careful harmony that had once seemed impossible, but now felt natural and sustainable. She had completed her medical degree with a specialty in supernatural physiology, working as an official liaison between human hospitals and supernatural communities while maintaining her private practice that served beings whose medical needs bridged physical and magical realms in ways that conventional medicine could not address effectively. The trauma from healing Morwen had faded to manageable levels through therapy that combined modern psychological techniques with supernatural healing methods, leaving her with enhanced abilities and deeper understanding of how different forms of suffering could be treated through appropriate combinations of scientific knowledge and magical intervention. Her role in supernatural governance had evolved exactly as she had planned, the temporary leadership position allowing her to establish systems that operated independently of her continued presence while training supernatural beings to manage human relations with confidence and competence that eliminated the need for constant mortal mediation. Damien had grown into his role as heir apparent with grace and wisdom that impressed even traditionalist vampires who had initially opposed his father's progressive policies. His leadership style, balancing respect for ancient customs with intelligent adaptation to contemporary challenges in ways that preserved vampire culture while allowing for beneficial innovation. Their relationship had evolved into a true partnership based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than mystical bonds or dramatic circumstances. Two people who had chosen each other through careful consideration of both strengths and limitations, learning to love each other's imperfections as much as their admirable qualities while supporting each other through the ongoing challenges of bridging different worlds. The vampire court had become a model for successful supernatural integration, hosting regular exchanges with human institutions that advanced medical research and cultural understanding while maintaining strict secrecy protocols that protected both communities from exposure to hostile elements who might exploit such knowledge for destructive purposes. The coffee shop itself had been transformed into an unofficial neutral ground where supernatural beings and sympathetic humans could interact safely. Its atmosphere of casual acceptance providing a space for relationships to develop naturally without the formal constraints that characterized official diplomatic meetings between species representatives. Maya's greatest satisfaction came not from any single dramatic rescue, but from observing how the principles of compassion and mutual aid had spread throughout the communities touched by the new covenant, creating networks of support that functioned independently of her personal intervention while maintaining the values of healing and protection that had originally motivated her defense of Damien. The morning brought familiar challenges as a group of supernatural purists attempted to intimidate the young werewolf child whose family had recently moved to the city, their harassment echoing the kind of bullying that had first brought Maya and Damien together in the same cafe where they now worked to create broader change. But this time, Maya was not alone in stepping forward to defend the vulnerable, Damien standing beside her along with representatives from a dozen supernatural communities who had learned to see the protection of innocent beings as everyone's shared responsibility rather than the burden of isolated individuals. The confrontation ended without violence, as the bullies found themselves facing not one brave waitress, but an entire community united by the principle that compassion was strength rather than weakness. Their retreat marking another small victory in the ongoing effort to create a world where kindness was expected and supported rather than rare and shocking. Maya's hands, scarred by magical healing but steady with accumulated experience, reached out to help the werewolf child stand up with dignity and tact, the gesture echoing her first encounter with Damien, while also representing how far both she and supernatural society had traveled toward a future where such acts of mutual support were normal rather than extraordinary. The circle of healing continued to expand beyond its original participants, no longer dependent on one person's exceptional compassion, but supported by communities that had chosen to value and protect that compassion in all their members, creating sustainable systems of care that would outlast any individual while preserving the essential human and supernatural qualities that made such caring both possible and necessary.